Gold, a word that connotates wealth and status. There's truly no material quite like gold. Maybe with the possible exception of diamonds. Nothing quite exudes the highest the high as gold. This element, with an atomic number of 79, forged in the supernovas and the clashes of various neutron stars among the vastness of the cosmos, would become one of the most coveted substances in the history of our species. And while the celestial bodies were unaware of their creation, billions of years later, a bipedal ape on a small chunk of rock called Earth would become witness to this rare, shiny yellow metal that would transform its trajectory forever. The story of gold is one that places value not on necessity and function, but rather on scarcity and beauty. Gold, while having some limited functional applications, would become arguably the most coveted substance on the planet. Gold cannot be drank, it cannot be eaten in large quantities, it cannot be used to build houses, and it cannot be used to forge weapons. After all, it's a soft metal with limited applications. But nonetheless, it would be seen as being far more valuable than the water we drink, the food we eat, the iron, stone, and wood of which we build our entire civilizations upon. All of this for what is essentially a soft, shiny metal. Many theories have come around as to why humans like shiny things, why we find them so beautiful and captivating. One explanation that I find particularly compelling is that humans living across the African savanna were looking for fresh water, and it just so happens to be that anything that looks wet usually looks shiny, and thereby anything that is shiny, regardless of whether or not it's wet, looks beautiful. And gold just so happens to be very shiny. And the color yellow just so happens to be the brightest of all colors, especially when it's shiny. Gold is not the only shiny substance out there. Obsidian stone is black and it's shiny and beautiful, but nowhere near as valuable. Silver is technically a shiny version of gray or white, and it's actually more functionally useful than gold. And copper is also a shiny reddish orangish color, and is also very beautiful, but none of these metals compared to the allure of gold. After all, when athletes win medals, third place goes to bronze, which is a mix of copper and tin, second to silver, and first to gold. Gold is one of the 7 metals of antiquity, alongside the aforementioned silver and copper, and tin, along with lead, mercury, and iron. Iron is quite possibly the most useful, followed by copper and tin, and mercury and lead are quite fantastic for killing you. Silver, while beautiful and fairly useful, is also coveted, but will always be second to gold. And so how did this soft metal with limited functionality become so valuable? Well, I would argue that scarcity is the main answer. Gold is very rare, extremely rare in its pure form, oftentimes only found in microscopic particles in rocks, usually alongside quartz, which are also beautiful, and made up of silicon dioxide. Gold is oftentimes found alongside silver, its second place friend. Gold is more rare than copper and silver, and its scarcity led to gold being seen as being more valuable, despite the fact that in many ways silver and copper are probably more useful. After all, they are better conductors of electricity, which is a lifeline for our current energy grid. Gold could not be combined with tin to create bronze, and is nowhere near as useful on a functional level as iron. Yet because of its scarcity, it became the most desired. Early humans during the Stone Age interacted with gold on rare occasions. Obviously, they lacked the technology to engage in metallurgy or deep underground mining, though. They would occasionally come across small pieces of gold on the surface, usually found in traces of alloys. The first human artifacts that contain gold go back well over 6,000 years ago. Some of the earliest traces of gold artifacts are found in burial sites. Keep in mind that humans would place great reverence and respect for their dead, and the fact that they would bury the dead with gold in a place where living people could no longer make use of the gold substances pretty much meant that they put a tremendous amount of emphasis and importance on these gold artifacts. It is most likely the case that people who are buried with gold artifacts had some degree of status and power, After all, gold is rare. Not everybody could be buried with something made out of gold. Eventually, complex societies would emerge in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the ancient Egyptians just so happened to love their gold, given the fact that it was both rare and beautiful, and usually used it for ornamental purposes, alongside the highest of elites, namely the pharaoh and his family. In sharp contrast to other types of metals such as copper and tin, which were by and large used for ordinary life, ancient Egyptians used gold for their tombs, and the pharaoh would supposedly bring them with him to the afterlife. And speaking of ancient Egypt, the book of Exodus in the Bible, which is not historically accurate, does give some insight to the ancient reverence, allure, and temptations of gold. For when Moses led his people, the Israelites, out of Egypt and traveled up Mount Ararat to bring the Ten Commandments down, he eventually found them worshipping a golden calf. The story exemplifies not only the allure of gold, but oftentimes the vapid obsession with wealth and status that the shiny metal induces in the human consciousness, oftentimes at the expense of greater spiritual matters. Another story in our species canon that exemplifies the excesses of gold and wealth is the story of King Midas. According to this narrative, and again we don't know to what extent King Midas really existed or what his life was like, was nonetheless said to be a king in Asia Minor, in what is now the Asian part of Turkey. But according to Greek mythology, everything King Midas touched turned into gold. Sounds great until everything he touched literally turned into gold, including his food, and thereby he would die of starvation. The story, while clearly not literally true, is a cautionary tale about the obsession with status and wealth alone. Nonetheless, it would be in Asia Minor where King Midas supposedly lived, and the culture known as the Lydians would develop the first system of coinage, using gold. Gold, after all, is soft and malleable, and its rarity proved to be the perfect material for money. And the rise of gold coins eventually replaced barter, and became the dominant mechanism of trade. They could create standards to ensure certain sizes and weights, along with a seal that could exemplify the authority of whatever political or economic entity coined them. When it came to functional use, metals came and gone. First we had stone, which isn't even a metal, it's a rock. Then it was replaced by copper, and then copper combined with tin to create bronze, and then bronze was replaced by iron. And now there are various forms of iron alloys, namely steel, which produce stronger and stronger substances. And the future will probably see other substances that are even stronger than steel. But all of those were for functional matters. Metallurgy techniques based upon how much heat humans could command, and thereby melt, resulting in better and better quality materials. And while usefulness is, well, useful, it isn't necessarily pretty, unlike, say, gold. Alchemy, which is considered to be the proto-science predating modern science of chemistry, was practiced by men who want to turn substances such as lead, a deadly metal, into gold, a beautiful, non-murderous metal, using a material called the Philosopher's Stone, which was in no way, shape, or form invented by J.K. Rowling, but rather by the people of the classical and Middle Ages seeking to create some sort of substance that would transform ugly metals into beautiful ones. Alas, the Philosopher's Stone does not exist. However, these alchemists and their lust for gold would set up the foundations of modern chemistry during the 1700s. Before that, though, empires rose and fell, in part due to their treasuries of gold. What is so fascinating about gold is that the allure is cross-cultural. You can see this among Eastern Orthodox churches of Greece and Russia, the Buddhist temples of Nepal and Thailand, the Islamic Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and countless other sacred places where people have communed with the divine. A material object so embedded into the imagination of the supernatural and spiritual and eternal, yet it's still part of the material world. Places rich in gold deposits would become some of the wealthiest on the planet. Today we oftentimes don't associate sub-Saharan Africa with wealth, but at one point the wealthiest man adjusted for inflation in history was Mansa Musa in what is now Mali. He was the emperor of the Mali Empire during the 1300s, and much of his wealth came from gold. However, the story of Mansa Musa provides a practical example of how the allure of gold can be deceiving. Unlike King Midas's touch, which is shrouded in mythology, Mansa Musa was a real man, and he engaged in his pilgrimage to Mecca. When he arrived in Egypt at the halfway point, he provided so much money to charity in the form of gold that it created hyperinflation. There was so much gold that gold was no longer considered scarce and thereby became less valuable. This would become one of the first times when the shiny allure of gold would become dimmer. Fast forward over 200 years later, and we get another empire famed for its lust of gold, the Spanish. They would take up much of the Western Hemisphere, namely Central and South America, in search for gold, God, and glory. God provided them with the spiritual yearning to convert the people of the Americas to Christianity, glory exhibited by the tales of people who would tell their conquest to their children and their grandchildren, abstract concepts. However, gold is easier to understand. These guys were oftentimes looking for get-rich-quick schemes. The golden gates of heaven are unneeded when you have the vast riches of the Americas, and many a conquistador believed in the tale of El Dorado, the famous city of gold. Alas, the city did not exist. However, there was a real powerful South American empire that had a lot of gold. When the Spanish arrived on the shores of what is now Peru, they encountered the Incans. The Incan Empire was essentially a proto-communist state. It was centralized in its economy, and like many communist economies during the 20th century, their form of currency was essentially labor. And this created a system of forced labor without a currency, quite possibly the most complex society in human history without any formal currency. They did have tons of gold, but despite their lack of currency, they kept their gold, not for coins, but rather for ornamental purposes. They considered it to be the tears of the sun, and the silver to be tears of the moon. The Spanish saw it differently. They believed that this wasn't the result of a crying god, but rather a way to get rich. The Spanish would eventually capture the last Incan emperor, tell the Incans to fill up a room of gold and silver in order to free him, then took that gold and silver and then killed the emperor anyway. Perhaps the Incans got the last laugh though, because the Spanish had gotten so much gold from the Americas that they too created hyperinflation, and much of their power and wealth eventually dwindled and would be replaced and overtaken by far more financially and fiscally responsible empires of the Netherlands, France, and Britain. The allure of gold, however irrational, did not stop there though. During the 1800s, there would be gold rushes throughout much of the Americas and Oceania, the most famous one of which is of course the California Gold Rush, in which people from all over the world would seek out get-rich-quick schemes in California, only to find out that many of them would die penniless seeking the gold. And while they didn't get too many riches, the people who did get riches were the ones selling the pickaxes, jeans, and other products used by the miners. If you own a pair of Levi's jeans, you have the California Gold Rush to thank for it. You have probably also heard of fool's gold. This is a reference to iron pyrite, a far more common substance, oftentimes found by supposed gold miners who fell in love with this beautiful color, not knowing that it wasn't really gold. And likewise, today there are countless knockoffs of other luxury items. Pyrite would eventually become the most famous natural knockoff of gold, but keep in mind that knockoffs are universal. Eventually, economies became so big that they just couldn't rely on gold and silver alone to exemplify their wealth in a form of a currency. As a result, you had paper money, but this paper money was initially backed by gold coins and by gold bars. To this day, many central banks contain a lot of gold. However, as economies became larger and larger, they could not simply base their economic growth on how much gold could be extracted from some mine in South Africa. Eventually, the UK would drop the gold standard during the Great Depression, and the US would get rid of the gold standard during the 1970s. After spending so much money during the Vietnam War, Nixon took the US off the gold standard and ended the Bretton Woods system, in which many countries had their currencies pegged to the US dollar. Today, what is holding our currency together is not gold or silver, but rather trust. Trust in our institutions, trust in our own society. Gold still does play a role in the banking system, however, it's usually more of a supplementary role, oftentimes quite popular among right-leaning libertarians. However, this has also led to a bunch of gold scam schemes in which many people pay overpriced prices for gold rather than investing in assets that appreciate better over time. Now, gold has also been used for more limited applications for some high-end electronics, and it can also be used for more stupid applications, for example, gold leaves on luxury food items at fancy restaurants. This is because gold in very small quantities is biocompatible. However, you're not really going to get any good flavor or texture from a gold leaf on your cake. Today, gold has even garnered a reputation for being gaudy, for being excessive and pretentious. This is unsurprising. In much of our modern, ascetic world, we tend to eschew some of the more elitist elements, favoring a more democratized aesthetic. We can see this in our skyscrapers that are not particularly fancy or ornate as the heritage buildings of old. People, generally speaking, prefer Hollywood movies rather than going to high-end theaters, and likewise, the allure of gold has dimmed down. Many people prefer burgers over fine cuts of steak, and likewise, much of this exemplifies the fact that many people have taken to the idea that perhaps gold is just a tad bit overrated. Gold is not always golden. Nonetheless, gold will still likely to continue to have a special place in the human consciousness, oftentimes as a synonym for anything that is marvelous and great. But at the same time, the story of gold is one of greed and excess desire, oftentimes to self-destructive proportions. In other words, enjoy the splendor of the shininess, but don't get blinded by it.